Hi everyone, Tiffany here from Tiffany Cosplay to tell you how I made my World of Warcraft cosplay. The set that I made is the Radiant Lightbringer armor set, Mythic recoloring, with the Permafrost cape and Ashbringer Sword. In this cosplay, I am submitting for the Twitch 2020 cosplay competition into the armor category. Now let's first talk about how I made the Ashbringer Sword. I first traced it onto insulation foam and then cut it out using a hot wire. I used a sanding drum to sand all of the pieces. I then cut out a 4mm EVA foam. To attach the EVA foam elements to the insulation foam, I used wood glue. To create the battle damage throughout the sword, I used a sanding disc. For the handle and the floating hand of the sword, I 3D modeled in Rhino 6 and printed on my Prusa i3 Mark 2.5 3D printer in ABS filament. To get rid of the 3D printed stair step, I used 2 heavy coats of sandable spray paint, which I then sanded. I sprayed 4 heavy coats of Plasti Dip onto all parts, and then used Tester's airbrush paint to paint the rest of the sword. For the bodysuit, I used some scrap fabric I had laying around to draw all my base line work, and ended up making all of my line work in Adobe Illustrator, and then imported into Photoshop, and then with each color went in individually with different paintbrushes and opacities to slowly bring each of these colored layers to life. I then had to format them so they would fit on each of my yard of fabrics, so then I could custom print them onto sport lycra fabric, cut it out, and then sewed it together. Now to talk about the armor. The leg covers are composed mostly of 2, 4, and 20mm EVA foam. I cut out each of the pieces, heat treated, sanded, and assembled each of the layers with contact cement glue. Again, adding battle damage throughout the pieces using the sanding disc. These pieces were then sprayed with 3 coats of Plasti Dip and then airbrush painted with Tester's airbrush paint for blues, a golden yellow, and silvers and brown. And all pieces throughout this cosplay were sealed at the end using satin clear enamel spray paint. For the belt, I pretty much did the same process as the leg covers, sanding, heat treating, battle damage, but for this piece I wanted it to look more like fabric for the blue dimensional pieces. So I created these 2 awkward shapes that protruded from the sides and then draped it with 2mm EVA foam. For the center rings of each of the pieces, I used a ribbon spool and repeated my same paint job with Plasti Dip and then Tester's airbrush paint using the yellows, silvers, blues, and browns. And for hiding all of my connection pieces throughout the costume, as well as parts onto the bodysuit, I used Velcro. The shoulder pads were a bit more tricky to do, and to do this, I ended up 3D modeling the book, the hammer, as well as the floating pieces, and also a base structure for all of the pieces to interlock with clear acrylic rods, and then went with about 3 or 4 coats going back and forth, sanding and spraying another until each of the pieces no longer showed the stair steps. For all of the EVA foam parts of the shoulder pads, I used a combination of 2, 4, and 20mm EVA foam, cutting with a X-Acto knife and a box cutter, and sanding with a sanding drum. To create the blue fabric part of the shoulder pads, I stacked up about 40mm worth of EVA foam and then kind of carved it with a sanding drum, and then draped 2mm EVA foam over the piece and doing 4 coats of Plasti Dip, and then painted each piece the blue and the yellow, followed by a gradient, and continued with shadowing as well as detailed painting by hand. The final parts were to seal each piece with the satin clear enamel spray paint, and then assemble each of the pieces together with epoxy. The cape is made out of veg tan leather as well as a black cowhide leather. I traced all of my pieces and cut out using an X-Acto knife. I airbrush painted each one blues, purples, golds, and blacks. And for the decorative gold swirls on the pieces, I went in by hand using gold airbrush paint. To attach all of the pieces together, I first started off using leather weld glue onto the back side of each of the pieces, and then went back with my sewing machine and a leather needle to stitch each of these pieces down. And that's a real quick sum up of how I made my World of Warcraft cosplay. Thanks guys for watching, much love!